The cameras were already rolling when it happened. A room full of reporters, microphones angled like 100 watchful eyes, caught the exact instant Donald Trump's palm crashed against the polished table. The sound wasn't just a thud, it was a cannon blast echoing through the chamber. His eyes locked on to Keir Starmer with the fire of a man who had no intention of yielding. Then came the words, spat like lightning tearing across a summer sky. Asterisk. No, I don't agree. Asterisk. The room froze. Reporters who had been scribbling notes jerked their heads upward. Pens stopped mid-sentence, keyboards went silent, and even the hum of the cameras seemed to hesitate. For one elongated heartbeat, time itself slowed. Every gaze started between the two men, the sharp, lawyerly coolness of Starmer and the unrestrained, defiant energy of Trump. The tension was so thick, it felt like the oxygen had been stolen from the room. Starmer's lips curled into a thin smile, a mask of composure concealing the sting of the challenge. But the mask was fragile, and everyone knew it. Trump leaned forward, the weight of his presence pressing down like a storm cloud about to break. His voice was raw, not rehearsed, not polite, authentic in its force. It was the voice of a man who, for better or worse, had never once cared about playing by the quiet rules of diplomacy. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A journalist in the second row mouthed, "Oh my God," while the flash of cameras erupted, trying to capture history in real time. This wasn't just another briefing. This was collision of egos, of nations, of visions for the future. And in that collision, every immigrant family watching at home, every worker who felt dismissed by elites, every outsider who had ever been told to stay silent, saw something of themselves. Because the words weren't just directed at Starmer, they were aimed at the very idea of submission, at the notion that America or its people should bow, nod, and pretend to agree when their guts screamed otherwise. Trump's explosion wasn't polished rhetoric. It was raw defiance, and in its rawness lay its power. The silence stretched, broken only by the frantic clicking of shutters. And as the weight of that moment settled over the room, one truth became undeniable. This was only the beginning. But no one in that room could have predicted the chain reaction this moment would unleash. Hours before the explosion, before the table slam that would ricochet across newsrooms worldwide, there was already a current of unease surrounding the briefing. The backdrop was more than a polite exchange of two leaders. This was the United States and the United Kingdom, two allies bound by history, yet quietly diverging in vision. Every camera trained on that podium wasn't just waiting for words, it was waiting for sparks. Whispers had been swirling for days. Analysts speculated about the policy gaps widening between Washington and London. On trade, Starmer was hinting at protectionism while Trump vowed unshakable America-first principles. On immigration, the contrast was even sharper. Starmer's language of humanitarian frameworks clashed with Trump's iron rhetoric of sovereignty and strength. And hanging over it all was the press, hungry for confrontation, framing this meeting not as diplomacy but as a showdown. Reporters had sensed it. This was never going to be a cordial handshake and smile affair. Every headline teased tension. Asterisk. Clash expected at joint briefing. Asterisk, asterisk. Trump and Starmer set for collision course. Asterisk, asterisk. Special relationship tested in real time. Asterisk, the atmosphere was electric, as if everyone in the room knew history was about to be written, but no one could guess the script. But underneath the policy disputes lay something even bigger, a clash of political identities. Starmer represented the polished, lawyerly elite, a man groomed in the corridors of British institutions. He carried himself with the certainty of rules, procedure, and carefully constructed language. Trump, on the other hand, embodied raw defiance. He was the street fighter of politics, armed not with footnotes and talking points, but with gut instinct and a refusal to bend. For one, diplomacy was a stage for civility. For the other, it was a battlefield. This wasn't just about trade numbers or policy papers. It was about vision. One leader spoke to a world that wanted hierarchy, order, and quiet compromise. The other roared to those who had grown tired of being silenced by institutions that spoke times at times them, rather than times for times them. In that clash, the stakes were not just national but personal. Every viewer watching from a kitchen table in Detroit, every immigrant family in Birmingham tuning in, every worker scrolling headlines on a late shift, they were all about to witness which vision would prevail. By the time the two men took their seats, anticipation was a living thing. Journalists exchanged knowing glances. Cameras hovered in silence. And the tension was so tangible it seemed to press against the walls. Everyone expected sparks, but no one expected fire. That fire came the moment Trump shattered the veneer of civility with his thunderous, "No, I don't agree." And in that instant, the stakes became crystal clear. This was no longer about the fine print of a policy briefing. It was about identity, who gets to define truth, who has the right to defy, who will be remembered as standing tall when the world tried to push them down. Every headline had hinted at a confrontation brewing, but what came next made history. To understand why the room froze, we need to look at the man sitting across from Trump and the contradictions in his story. For many in Britain, Keir Starmer projects the image of calm, calculated authority. He carries himself like the seasoned lawyer he once was, each phrase sculpted to sound precise, principled, deliberate. To the casual observer, he appears every bit the embodiment of order, a man who thrives in the predictable rhythm of rules and precedent. When he steps to a podium, tie knotted just so, expression measured, his voice doesn't thunder. It glides, like a courtroom barrister making his case not to a jury of citizens but to history itself. It's this carefully polished exterior that made him such an appealing figure to many of his supporters. Here was a man who promised stability in a world spinning with chaos, who offered procedure as a balm to disruption. He cultivated the image of the grown-up in the room, the one who would restore dignity to politics after years of drama. His speeches often brimmed with talk of principles, values, the rule of law. He seemed to embody calm reason. But beneath the veneer, critics have long argued, lies something far more opportunistic. Starmer has been accused of bending whichever way the wind blows, of cloaking ambition in the language of principle. He presented himself as the unshakable defender of the people, but his career was built in the shadowy corridors of institutions that rarely heard the voices of ordinary workers. For every vow of honesty, skeptics pointed to moments where his stances shifted, where his promises morphed under pressure. To his detractors, Starmer was not a beacon of principle, but the quintessential insider, polished, privileged, protected. He wore the robes of dignity, yet behind closed doors, he played the game like every other career politician, cautious when boldness was required, calculating when clarity was demanded. That lawyerly poise, critics claimed, wasn't a symbol of strength, but of distance, a reminder that he had lived most of his life arguing rules rather than feeling the weight of them. And yet, he carried himself with an air of superiority, as if diplomacy were his natural domain, as if his word could smooth over the jagged edges of any confrontation. In Britain, that posture often worked. Against opponents who were either intimidated by his composure or unwilling to break the unwritten codes of political theater, Starmer's calm mask gave him the upper hand. He could dismiss, redirect, or reframe without raising his voice. But masks, no matter how well crafted, are fragile when tested by fire. And across the Atlantic stood a man who despised masks. Donald Trump was not a figure who respected the slow dance of procedure or the careful etiquette of diplomacy. He thrived on stripping away pretenses, tearing through the scripts others clung to, and dragging hidden contradictions into the light. If Starmer's greatest strength was his polish, then Trump's greatest weapon was his refusal to be polished at all. That is why, when the two men finally sat across from each other in front of those cameras, the tension wasn't simply about trade policy or diplomatic statements. It was about something deeper. A man who had built his career on maintaining control of the room facing off against someone who relished blowing rooms apart. Starmer, in his tailored suit, believed composure was power. Trump believed power was the ability to expose composure as hollow. It was inevitable that they would clash. One represented the safe choice, the voice of institutions, the reassurance that systems would hum along as always. The other represented disruption, risk, the possibility that those very systems could be shattered in an instant. For Starmer, the confrontation was a chance to assert himself as a statesman on the world stage. For Trump, it was an opportunity to prove yet again that no elite veneer could withstand his unfiltered defiance. And so, as the press leaned forward in anticipation, as the silence stretched taut before the first words were spoken, the contrast became painfully clear. Starmer's polished arrogance met Trump's raw authenticity. The mask met the mirror. And yet, across the ocean, he would meet the one figure who refused to play along.
Because the story of this confrontation really begins with the relentless rise and resilience of Donald J. Trump. To understand why the moment carried such weight, we need to step back into the story of the man at the center of it all, Donald J. Trump. For decades, he has been painted in colors both vivid and polarizing. The billionaire real estate mogul, the television showman, the lightning rod politician who defied every prediction of political gravity. Love him or hate him, one truth remained undeniable. Trump never fit the mold, and he never wanted to. From the moment he descended that golden escalator in 2015, the establishment sneered. He was too brash, too unpolished, too raw. The pundits smirked, the columnists wrote him off, and political insiders shook their heads. Yet the more the elites dismissed him, the more millions of Americans saw something different, a reflection of themselves. Here was a man who didn't speak in rehearsed talking points, but in the blunt, unapologetic cadence of the streets. Where others performed, he provoked. Where others hedged, he hit. And in that authenticity, people heard not a politician, but a fighter. Fighting, after all, had become Trump's calling card. He faced impeachment battles that would have broken lesser men, each attempt framed as the nail in his political coffin. Twice they tried to brand him illegitimate, and twice he walked away emboldened, his base rallying tighter, louder, fiercer. He endured endless media wars, every headline sharpening him, every broadcast a challenge he answered with more fire. Instead of bending under the pressure of ridicule, he thrived on it, drawing energy from the storms that others thought would consume him. But to see Trump only as a brawler is to miss the deeper truth. Beneath the bravado lies a man fueled not just by conflict, but by loyalty to his supporters, the farmers in Iowa, the steel workers in Ohio, the small business owners in Florida. He is more than a politician. He is their champion, the one who looked at a system stacked against them and said, "I will fight for you." That loyalty was not transactional, it was personal. They believed in him because he had given them a reason to believe that their voices mattered. And in return, he carried their faith like armor. His resilience became his mythos. Every setback transformed into a rallying cry. Every scandal became another chance to prove he could not be broken. The media, intent on defining him, instead strengthened him, because every attack was received by his base as proof that he was the outsider, under siege. By the establishment they mistrusted. In Trump, they saw a man willing to absorb the blows they could not, a man unafraid to be mocked so long as he never surrendered. And that resilience brought him to stages where no one thought he would stand. The Oval Office, the World Summit tables, press briefings watched by millions. Each time he walked into those rooms, he carried not the weight of establishment approval, but the defiant pride of someone who had never asked permission. He was not supposed to belong in their world, and that was precisely why his supporters loved him. The confrontation with Starmer was not just another entry on his crowded calendar, it was a collision written by destiny. Across from him sat the embodiment of the establishment elite, a man trained in the art of legal maneuvering, fluent in the polite language of diplomacy, carrying himself as if history owed him a seat at the table. Trump had spent his life breaking into rooms where he was told he didn't belong. Starmer had spent his life being ushered into them. The contrast could not have been sharper. Trump, the outsider who never bowed. Starmer, the insider who had never truly been tested by fire, in that briefing room surrounded by flashing cameras and restless reporters, the weight of those opposing stories pressed together like tectonic plates. Something had to give, and everyone could feel it. Trump's eyes did not wander when he sat down. He wasn't there to charm. He wasn't there to posture. He was there, as always, to confront. His entire career had been defined by walking into hostile arenas and daring them to silence him. And when Starmer leaned ever so slightly forward, delivering his first carefully measured remarks, Trump's body tightened. To him, this wasn't about the wording of a diplomatic agreement. This was about the deeper struggle that had defined his entire political journey, the fight between authenticity and artifice, between truth as spoken by the people and truth as dictated by elites. Every moment of his past had led to this stage. Every battle scar, every media storm, every comeback had sharpened him for confrontation. Trump did not just thrive in conflict, he became most alive in it. And this wasn't just another press conference. This was the stage where his defiance would explode in full force. And when the cameras rolled, the tension became unbearable. The first words from Starmer were measured, almost soothing in their precision. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his tone wrapped in the silk of diplomacy. With a half smile, he remarked that shared responsibility requires shared understanding, a line delivered with just enough weight to feel like a rebuke without ever naming its target. The reporters caught it immediately. Heads tilted upward, pens scratched furiously, and a murmur of recognition swept through the room. Starmer wasn't simply stating policy, he was drawing a line, quietly daring Trump to cross it. Trump's eyes narrowed. His jaw set, and for a moment he didn't speak. The silence was heavier than words. Reporters leaned in, their anticipation buzzing like static. Then Trump shifted in his seat, his hand pressing firmly on the table, his voice dropping low but unmistakably sharp. Shared understanding, he repeated, the syllables dripping with disdain, only works when you're honest about what you're actually doing. The jab landed. Cameras clicked in bursts. Journalists scribbled notes with frantic urgency. Starmer raised an eyebrow, the faintest sign of irritation flickering across his polished mask. He countered, his tone still composed but now colder, suggesting that responsibility is not a slogan, it's a commitment. It was a lawyer's blow, subtle, cloaked, yet unmistakably meant to undermine. Trump didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, folding his arms with the calm confidence of a man who had lived his entire public life being underestimated. He let the words hang for a beat, then delivered his retort with deliberate slowness. The only commitment I know is to the people, not to pleasing headlines, not to elite circles who pat themselves on the back. His voice rose just enough to slice through the room. Reporters shifted uncomfortably, a nervous chuckle escaping from one corner. Starmer's composure began to morph into something sharper, his smirk betraying a sense of smug superiority. He fired back with sarcasm veiled as formality, noting that leadership means listening, not shouting. The words drew a few nods from sympathetic journalists, but they also seemed to bounce harmlessly off Trump, who had weathered far worse. The exchange grew tighter, sharper, like two swords clashing. Starmer's barbs grew bolder, his eyebrows arched in calculated disdain. Trump's responses, however, grew calmer, each one delivered with a deliberate steadiness that made the tension even more unbearable. Where Starmer relied on polished phrases, Trump spoke in blunt declarations that carried the weight of conviction. One man tried to lecture, the other refused to be lectured. The room pulsed with energy, flashbulbs burst in rapid succession. Every slight raise of an eyebrow, every pause between words, every shift of posture was captured, magnified, and immortalized. Reporters could feel it. The confrontation had tipped from policy to theater, from diplomacy to raw spectacle. By now, the crowd was on edge. Nervous chuckles erupted, only to be swallowed quickly in the charged silence. Pens scribbled frantically, as if every second risked missing the moment that might define the entire briefing. Trump's calm grew heavier, more imposing, while Starmer's smirk stretched thinner, more brittle. The balance was shifting, though neither man had yet delivered the decisive blow. The air seemed to vibrate with expectation. Trump's gaze locked onto Starmer, unblinking, unyielding. Starmer's voice sharpened again, but this time his words carried an edge of desperation beneath the smoothness. The audience felt it, his mask was cracking, and then Trump leaned forward, his shoulders squared, his hand tightening on the table once more. Everyone in the room knew it was coming, the breaking point. The moment when civility would shatter and history would etch itself into memory. But what Trump said next would shatter Starmer's confidence in front of the world. The room was suffocatingly still. Cameras froze mid-click. Journalists held their breath. Starmer had just landed what he thought was his most surgical jab yet, a neatly packaged quip about listening, not shouting. It had the rhythm of a courtroom flourish, the tone of a professor, Esra Perman, the smugness of someone certain he'd just scored the winning point. Trump didn't respond immediately, he didn't even blink. Instead, he let the silence expand until it was no longer silence. It was pressure, a thick invisible weight pressing down on everyone in the briefing room. A few reporters shifted nervously in their chairs. The sound of a pen dropping on the floor echoed like a gunshot. Then it happened. Trump leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. His voice began low, almost measured, but each syllable rolled like distant thunder drawing closer. As the briefing wound down, you could almost feel the digital shockwaves pulsing through cyberspace. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube all igniting at once, hashtags forming within minutes, clips being replayed, shared, dissected. For Starmer, it was humiliation. For Trump, it was triumph. For the world, it was spectacle. And once the cameras cut, the real battle began online. Fuck cunt. The cameras clicked off, but the echoes of that moment were only just beginning. Within minutes, Twitter erupted into a frenzy. Hashtags surged to the top of global trends. Pound Trump is Starmer. Pound press room explosion. Pound Neudont agree. Screens lit up in living rooms, airports, cafes, and taxis across continents. The confrontation wasn't just a political clash anymore. It was the internet's newest obsession. Memes spread like wildfire. One looped clip showed Trump slamming the table, slowed down to cinematic effect with thunder sound effects. Another froze on Starmer's blink. The exact moment his mask of composure cracked. Captioned, "When you realize the script isn't working." TikTok teens remixed it into dance edits, while Instagram Reels layered dramatic music over Trump's mic drop line. The battle had spilled from the briefing room into the bloodstream of global culture. Cable talk shows wasted no time. Commentators on both sides dissected the clash with feverish energy. Supporters framed Trump as the man who spoke raw truth against polished fakery. Critics painted him as reckless, destabilizing, dangerous. In Britain, morning panels scrambled to defend Starmer, but even his allies struggled to spin the optics. It was a difficult exchange, one host admitted, her voice tight, her eyes betraying doubt. In America, conservative pundits practically roared with triumph, while progressive voices wrestled with a paradox. The very man they resisted had managed to make the establishment villain look small. YouTube reaction videos multiplied by the hour. Influencers replayed the footage, gasping, pausing, rewinding the exact instant the tide turned. "Watch Starmer's face here," one said, zooming in on his twitching jaw. Others narrated with glee. Trump just buried him alive on live TV. Some creators took a more serious tone, reminding their audiences that the moment wasn't just theater, it carried the weight of diplomacy, identity, and power. The ripple effect was undeniable. In Washington, aides whispered about the geopolitical fallout. In London, the Prime Minister's team scrambled to contain the narrative before it grew uncontrollable. European outlets ran headlines like the clash heard around the world. Even in countries far removed from Anglo-American politics, the scene trended. It wasn't simply about leaders anymore. It was about authenticity versus pretense, defiance versus decorum, rawness versus polish. And ordinary citizens, from immigrant families in Queens to small-town voters in Yorkshire, asked themselves the same haunting question: who really stood for truth? Was it the polished lawyer who preached stability but couldn't mask his discomfort? Or the brash outsider who dared to slam the table and refused to play along? For millions watching, the answer felt clear, even if it unsettled them. Authenticity had triumphed over artifice. The internet magnified this verdict. Hashtags morphed into movements. Fan accounts clipped Trump's lines into motivational edits, set against soaring music, comment threads filled with declarations. Finally, someone said it: "This is why he can't be ignored." Meanwhile, critics scrambled to remind viewers of Trump's controversies, but the momentum wasn't theirs to control anymore. The spectacle had swallowed the nuance whole. By nightfall, one thing was certain: this was no longer just a briefing. It was a cultural flashpoint, a moment destined to be studied, replayed, weaponized, and remembered. The world had watched two men face off, but it wasn't just about them, it was about what they represented and what people hungered for in leaders. And yet, behind the noise, one moral lesson became impossible to ignore. When the noise finally softened, when the hashtags slowed, the memes settled, and the talking heads ran out of fresh spins, what lingered wasn't just a political quarrel. It was the undeniable contrast that had played out before the world's eyes. Dignity against arrogance, independence against scripted elitism, truth against political maneuvering. Trump had not entered that briefing to trade rehearsed lines or play to the polite applause of insiders. He came as he always did, raw, unfiltered, ready to stand his ground. Starmer, with his smooth cadence and lawyerly charm, had represented the establishment's insistence on control, on scripting, on keeping discourse boxed neatly within their rules. Yet it was precisely those rules that shattered under the weight of Trump's defiance. For many watching, this wasn't just about who won an argument, it was about what that argument represented. The immigrant cab driver, scrolling through clips on his phone, saw more than politics. He saw the defiance of someone unwilling to bow to elite expectation. The young voter, tired of prepackaged speeches, felt a spark of recognition, a reminder that strength comes not from following scripts, but from tearing them up. Even those who disliked Trump personally could not deny the resonance of a moment that cut through the fog of performance and exposed the vulnerability of polished arrogance. In that sense, Trump reframed the clash without needing to explain it. His table slam, his refusal to nod along, his blunt dismissal, these became symbols of a broader truth that sovereignty, pride, and independence should never be traded for polite applause. He had turned a press briefing into a parable. This wasn't about politics, one commentator admitted reluctantly, replaying the footage for the 100th time. It was about pride, sovereignty, and refusing to bow. Those words, spoken almost grudgingly, captured what millions already felt. Trump had turned the script upside down and, in doing so, reminded people of something. Elemental dignity is not granted by institutions. It is seized by those who refuse to be diminished. And so, the moral hardened into clarity. Arrogance hides behind polish. True strength is revealed in confrontation. And leadership, real leadership, is not about reciting lines in hopes of applause, but about embodying conviction in the face of scorn. The chaos of the briefing had birthed a universal lesson, one bigger than either man in that room. It was a lesson that spoke to anyone who had ever been talked down to, anyone who had ever been dismissed by elites, anyone who had ever been told to stay in their place. Because in that moment, the lesson was clear. You don't bow. You don't nod politely when the truth is on the line. You stand, you speak, and you let the silence that follows carry your message louder than words ever could. And for those watching, the story didn't just end there. From the moment Trump's hand struck the table to the instant his words echoed across the press room, "No, I don't agree," history was made. What unfolded wasn't a routine briefing. It was a cinematic clash that will be replayed for years to come. A moment when strength overpowered smugness, when resilience toppled scripted elitism, when unapologetic defiance cut through polished pretense. This wasn't just politics, it was theater, it was identity, it was a reminder of why people still watch. Because at its core, the explosion we witnessed was about more than two leaders facing off. It was about the eternal battle between those who cling to control and those who dare to defy it. Trump's eruption wasn't reckless, it was revelatory. It showed that even in rooms designed to stifle authenticity, dignity can roar louder than decorum. That no matter how carefully an opponent scripts his words, truth spoken with fire cannot be contained. And now, that story doesn't end here. It continues with you. If this moment struck a chord, if you felt the pulse of pride and the call of resilience in what you just witnessed, then don't let it fade. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, be part of the growing community that refuses to bow, refuses to be silenced, refuses to let arrogance win the narrative. Because in the end, it's not just leaders who shape history. It's people like you who carry the message forward. And together, we remind the world of a simple truth. Asterisk, asterisk, because in the end, dignity always finds its voice. Asterisk, asterisk.